And the most interesting of these vulnerabilities to talk about in the context of Rails is going to be the one called using components with known vulnerabilities. And for that, we're going to look at the gem file. So gem file in Rails applications and in a lot of Ruby applications is the dependency management manifesto. And what that means is if we look here, it lists a whole bunch of different software packages and it shows what versions they use and kind of explains a little bit about what they do. And the idea with that is that we declare the dependencies of the app so that we can then perform certain actions with the dependencies. For example, we can group them into different environment-based groups. We can have some annotation about platforms. For example, this bug will only work with Ruby implementations like MRI. And we also have some things that are exclusive to the development environment, and these are going to be all your debugging and development tools. There are certain things we only need for testing, and so on and so forth. We would have production as well if this was a production application. And there are certain things disabled by default, but that can be easily brought in. What we want to look at, though, is this capacity of Rails to specify a source for its dependencies. And here you see we have gem Rails, so we're using version 5.2.0, which is a very recent, latest and greatest kind of version as far as Rails is concerned at the current moment. But one thing that we can do is we can say, how about we use the latest, like the very latest available on GitHub. And if you go over to GitHub, you'll see that Rails has a repository, and that repository is actually very frequently updated with new commits, and those don't make up the 5.2.0 version of Rails. Actually, what is available there from master is going to be the next version of Rails, which is tentatively 6.0. So suppose we want to see if our application runs correctly against that version, or we want to see something like we need some features that are experimental, but it's okay, we are okay with the risk, so we're going to try it. But one thing to remember, and this is a double-edged sword, is how we go about doing this should be a little wary of just getting stuff from the internet. Even though that's where we get a lot of our software, there is a little bit of a distinction between getting something like Rails. So let's see, we have our bundle and we want to install because we just made a change. So you see it's now fetching it from GitHub and it's getting it from the Rails repository. So there's a problem here, and I'll explain the problem to you as this is downloading. You'll see we're using HTTP, and we are not using HTTPS, and we're not using the GET protocol. And the issue with that is that we are no longer in control of a secure transmission channel between ourselves and GitHub. And so if somebody was to perform a man-in-the-middle attack, which means that somewhere along the many hops that a network connection makes between yourself and the server you're getting resources from, somebody can tap in, or if somebody, a malicious party, happens to gain control of one of the many points between here and there, whether it's at the gateway level, whether it's at the switch or router level, whether it's one of the caching servers in between, one of the routing servers in between. I mean, there's a lot of places where somebody could try and play some malicious code which rewrites traffic. So, of course, in order to rewrite traffic, somebody would have to know what the traffic is. And the idea with HTTPS is that the traffic gets encrypted. So, like all the packets, all the characters get encrypted between yourself and the person that you're communicating with or server that you're communicating with. But when you do HTTP, all your communication is happening in plain text. So as long as somebody can get to it and can parse it, they can figure out how to make some string substitutions and put something else there, put different characters in there. So something like Rails, where we're downloading it, maybe somebody puts in one of those other vulnerabilities that we've been looking at because they can look at Rails and they can pattern match. And of course, I'm not talking about someone doing it manually. I'm talking about someone doing it using some kind of a script or some kind of automation. And the idea here is that we don't want to have a man-in-the-middle attack in our dependencies because we are running this code as trusted. So we are just running it directly on our machine. We're expecting to put some secrets into our configuration because we're probably going to connect to a database. We're probably going to integrate with some APIs, maybe with the cloud hosting provider. So our application will actually have some secrets, and we'll also have, of course, access to the data of our users. So we don't want to get compromised code. And this seems like such a weird little detail to get right. But that's really what a lot of web application security is. It's getting all the details right, because here we go. We are now on Rails 6 as far as this application is concerned, but we potentially are on a compromised version. And that's another thing worth remembering, is that since we are using a framework from outside of our own development, we cannot vouch for the kind of alpha version of something, and neither will the core team. Like, nobody will say this is definitely secure up to our standards, there's no known vulnerabilities. Usually until you get to the .1 or .2 version of the releases, like the current preferred version of Rails is 5.2.1. So that means that all the issues from Rails 5 have been resolved, even all the issues from 5.2 are getting resolved, and there's already been a patch release. And sometimes these issues are more about bugs, but sometimes they're about security vulnerabilities. And so if you're using alpha software or even pre-alpha software, there is a chance that there's going to be security vulnerabilities. And those combined with some of the other vulnerabilities we've seen could cause some serious issues. So we've talked about before about not wanting to have your software be too outdated, because then the patches go out of date, but you also perhaps don't want to be completely on the bleeding edge, because that can also sometimes lead to using vulnerable code. So there are two dangers here that we looked at. And one of the remediations is, of course, to just use stable releases for your production code, where your code is actually open to attack and open to security violations by external actors. But the other one is here. If you see, we actually have the solution. The solution has been provided to us by the Rails team in the actual comments of the gem file. And here we go. If you do this, you should technically be a lot better off, because now you're no longer relying on HTTP as a method of transport. You're on HTTPS. So as long as your certificates and SSL transport layer are not compromised, you should be encrypting traffic between yourself and GitHub. So at least you're safe from the man-in-the-middle attack. And what that means is that there is not a high chance that somebody's rewriting the Rails package and inserting malicious code while you download it. And here you can see it's GitHub, right? So what this ends up doing is this line right here. It ends up converting anything that says GitHub : string into https github.com/string. And that's the address of the Rails repo. So if we go over to our browser, we can actually hit the Rails repo, Rails, and you'll see it in GitHub. And there it is. And there's the repo. So that's where we would be getting our code from. So we are now going to see what it looks like to get it here. There we go. We still have Rails v6 alpha, and we can also go back to our previous version easily. But that was a much safer way to get it. HTTPS, we definitely know we're connecting to GitHub, unless there's a much larger compromise, in which case we have bigger issues. So here we go. If we do bundle install again, we'll see it's grabbing all the same gems that we were using before. And there we go. If we now run Rails V, we're back to 5.2.1. And that's how we mitigate working with vulnerable components in Rails.